Hi, this is Janet, and this is my presentation on a poet-author. I'm doing Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman was born to Walter Whitman Sr. and Louisa Van Velser, May 31st, 1819, in West Hill, New York, 30 years after George Washington was inaugurated president. When Walt was 4, his father moved the family to Brooklyn, and they continued to have children. He ended up being the second of 8 children. Walt loved living close to the East River, riding the ferries. He loved the people who worked on them. He would later write the poem Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, which spoke of how those trips on the ferry made him feel. Walt stopped his formal schooling at age 11 and went to work for some Brooklyn lawyers as an office boy. A year later, he became an apprentice to a printer and learned how to typeset newspaper articles. In a couple of years, he was typesetting his own articles and feeling the excitement of seeing his own words in print. By the time he was 16, he was a journeyman printer and compositor in New York City. Then 2 major fires took out the biggest printing businesses in the city, and so he returned to New Jersey where his family was living. At 17, he began teaching because he didn't want to be a farmer like his dad. Teaching wasn't his favorite job, but he needed the work. When he was 19, he tried his hand at writing and publishing a newspaper, The Long Islander, but that folded after a year, and so he went back to teaching for another 3 years. He loved to immerse himself in words, both written and spoken, so he often took the ferry to Manhattan, where he watched and spoke to everyone. He also loved the outdoors and made trips to the countryside, where he would wander down quiet roads, through forests and apple and walnut groves. He began writing his ideas for poems on little notebooks that he had made, and had one with him all the time. Walt's poems were not like anyone else's of the day. They were free-flowing, and wild, not metered and rhyming like the poems of the day. In 1861, tensions between the North and the South were rising, and Abraham Lincoln was elected president. When the Civil War began, Walt was too old to fight, but his father George wasn't, and he watched him march away to battle. It was during this time that he wrote Beat, Beat Drums, which talks about sons, fathers, grooms, and farmers being torn away from their families. Walt looked every day in the newspaper for his brother's name to see if he had been injured or killed. And during this time, he kind of felt the pull to go to the Broadway Hospital in Manhattan so that he could help the wounded soldiers. He tried to bring them comfort by visiting with them and listening to their stories, getting to know them. Sometimes he just sat and didn't talk at all, and just held their hand while they died. When he heard that his brother had been wounded, he searched until he found him in a hospital in Falmouth, Virginia. He had been wounded in the cheek by a shell, Walt stayed in the camp for a week until his brother was well enough to go back to battle. And during that time, he visited all the hospitals and wrote in his notebooks. And something he wrote was, "I go around from one case to another. I do not see that I do much good, but I cannot leave them." As he listened to their stories and learned their lingo, like bivouac for camp, army pies and wash meant crackers and coffee, he wrote and gave the soldiers a voice. After the war was over, Walt put his Civil War poems in a book and called it Drum Taps. Walt's book, Leaves of Grass, was published and printed 9 times between 1855 and 1892 and contained almost 300 poems, which would become his life's work. Although the book was given a rather disappointing reception, Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was one of Walt's heroes, he was one of the few literary men who saw the merit in this strange little book. And he wrote Walt a letter, and the beginning of it states, "I greet you at the beginning of a great career, which yet must have had a long foreground somewhere for such a start." Walt took great pride in that praise. But he spent another 40 years trying to get it just right, and he died in 1892, but he was content with it. Today, Walt Whitman is considered one of America's most important poets. My favorite poem by Walt Whitman is "O Captain, My Captain," but I can never get through it without tearing up, so I won't be reading that one. I also like "O Me, O Life," "A Sight in Camp," "In the Daybreak Gray and Dim," and "The Wound Dresser." Whitman changed the face of poetry with his free verse. Although his poetry was once considered obscene by some, he was often perceived as an arrogant man. He did live to see his work rise to prominence. And I will read "A Sight in Camp, in the Daybreak Gray and Dim." A sight in camp in the daybreak gray and dim, as from my tent I emerge so early sleepless, as slow I walk in the cool fresh air, the path near the hospital tent. 3 forms I see on stretchers lying, brought out there untended, lying over each the blanket spread, ample brownish woolen blanket, gray and heavy blanket, folding, covering all. Curious, I halt and silent stand. Then with light fingers, I from the face of the nearest, the first, just lift the blanket. Who are you, elderly man, so gaunt and grim, with well-grayed hair and flesh all sunken about the eyes? Who are you, my dear comrade? Then to the second I step. And who are you, my child and darling? Who are you, sweet boy, with cheeks yet blooming? Then to the third, a face, nor child nor old, very calm, as of beautiful yellow-white ivory. Young man, I think I know you. I think this face is the face of the Christ himself, dead and divine, and brother of all, and here again he lies. The activity that I came up with for this was some torn paper art. I thought the kids would have fun with it. I know I did. All right, thank you.